Wealthy households could afford to import grain from distant regions or store their harvests in conditions that minimized fungal contamination. The poor, however, had little choice but to consume whatever bread they could obtain, often from the very grain that harbored the deadly ergot fungus. This pattern of differential impact reinforced existing social hierarchies, while adding another layer of suffering to lives already marked by hardship and deprivation. The psychological impact of witnessing ergotism outbreaks cannot be overstated. Imagine a medieval peasant watching his neighbor suddenly begin convulsing violently before his very eyes, screaming about visions of hell and damnation. Picture a mother helplessly observing as her child's fingers blackened and fell away piece by piece, despite her desperate prayers and offerings to every saint she could name. These experiences traumatized entire communities, creating collective memories of horror that persisted for generations. Medieval attempts to treat ergotism were uniformly futile and often counterproductive. Physicians prescribed bloodletting to remove circulation problems and accelerated gangrene. Pilgrimage to holy sites was considered the most effective remedy, leading to massive movements of sick and dying people who spread panic wherever they traveled. The ineffectiveness of these treatments only deepened the sense of helplessness and divine abandonment that characterized the medieval response to epidemic disease. The economic consequences of ergotism outbreaks rippled through medieval society in complex and devastating ways. When ergot contaminated grain stores, entire regions faced not only immediate health crises, but also long-term food shortages. Merchants hesitated to trade in affected areas, fearing both contagion and economic loss. Agricultural productivity plummeted as farmers became reluctant to plant rye, the crop most susceptible to ergot infection, but also a dietary staple for much of the population. This created a vicious cycle where attempts to avoid the disease led to malnutrition and increased vulnerability to other illnesses. The random and inexplicable nature of ergotism outbreaks also contributed to the climate of fear and superstition that permeated medieval life. Unlike plague, which followed somewhat predictable patterns of transmission, ergotism seemed to strike without warning or apparent cause. This unpredictability made it particularly terrifying to populations already struggling with the uncertainties of daily survival. The disease became associated with divine displeasure, leading to increased religious fervor, persecution of marginalized groups, and desperate attempts to appease an apparently angry God through extreme acts of penance and sacrifice. Yet another disease that haunted medieval populations was what we now know as tuberculosis, though it was known by many names including consumption, phthisis, and the wasting disease. Unlike the dramatic and sudden onset of plague or ergotism, tuberculosis was a slow killer that consumed its victims gradually over months or years. This prolonged dying process created its own unique form of suffering, as families watched beloved relatives slowly fade away, their bodies becoming increasingly frail and skeletal, despite desperate attempts at treatment and care. The symptoms of tuberculosis were both debilitating and socially stigmatizing. The characteristic persistent cough, often accompanied by blood-stained sputum, marked sufferers as diseased and potentially dangerous to others. Medieval people correctly observed that the disease seemed to spread among household members, though they attributed this to corrupted air or divine punishment rather than bacterial transmission. The wasting away of flesh, despite maintained appetite in early stages, seemed particularly mysterious and frightening to observers who had no understanding of the underlying pathological processes. Tuberculosis struck all levels of medieval society, but had particularly devastating effects on urban populations living in crowded, poorly ventilated conditions. Monasteries, with their communal living arrangements and shared dormitories, were especially vulnerable to tuberculosis outbreaks that could decimate entire religious communities. The disease showed no respect for holiness or devotion, striking down pious monks and nuns alongside the most hardened sinners, challenging religious explanations that linked illness to moral failings. The prolonged nature of tuberculosis created unique social and economic burdens for medieval families. Unlike diseases that killed quickly, consumption required extended periods of care that could bankrupt households and exhaust the emotional resources of caretakers. Sufferers often remained partially functional for months or years, creating difficult decisions about work, marriage, and inheritance. Children with tuberculosis pose particularly heartbreaking dilemmas, as parents face the agonizing choice between continued costly treatment and acceptance of inevitable death. Medieval treatments for tuberculosis ranged from the merely ineffective to the actively harmful. Physicians prescribed complex regimens involving dietary restrictions, herbal preparations, and bloodletting that often weakened patients further. The wealthy might travel to distant locations seeking cures, spending fortunes on treatments that provided false hope but no real benefit. Religious remedies included pilgrimage to holy sites, veneration of specific saints, and participation in elaborate rituals designed to win divine favor and healing. The social isolation experienced by tuberculosis sufferers was less dramatic than that imposed on lepers, but equally devastating in its own way. The visible signs of the disease, the persistent cough, the gradual wasting, the bloody sputum, marked victims as diseased and potentially contagious. Many found themselves gradually excluded from social gatherings, religious services, and economic activities as community members sought to protect themselves from infection. This isolation compounded the physical suffering of the disease with profound loneliness and despair. The impact of tuberculosis on medieval artistic and intellectual life was particularly poignant. Many of the era's most creative minds fell victim to the disease, their potential contributions to human knowledge and culture cut short by the slow progression of consumption. Monasteries lost scribes and illuminators whose painstaking work preserved classical learning and created beautiful manuscripts. Craft guilds saw master artisans waste away before they could fully train the next generation, creating gaps in knowledge and skill that sometimes took decades to fill. Perhaps most tragically, tuberculosis often struck young adults in their most productive years, robbing families of breadwinners and communities of their most energetic members. The disease showed a particular affinity for pregnant women and nursing mothers, creating cascading tragedies that claimed multiple generations simultaneously. Children orphaned by tuberculosis faced uncertain futures in a society with limited provisions for their care and education. The cumulative impact of these diseases, plague, smallpox, typhoid, tuberculosis, influenza, dysentery, leprosy, and ergotism, created a medieval world defined by suffering, uncertainty, and early death. Yet what emerges most powerfully from studying this litany of affliction is not despair, but rather profound admiration for human resilience. Despite facing diseases that modern medicine can prevent or cure, medieval people found ways to create meaning, beauty, and community in the midst of unimaginable hardship. They developed elaborate systems of care for the sick and dying, established institutions to support orphans and widows, and created art and literature that transformed suffering into transcendence. Their responses to epidemic disease, while often medically misguided, demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and adaptability. Most importantly, they never lost their fundamental humanity or their capacity to find joy and purpose even in the darkest of circumstances. The diseases that ravaged medieval Europe were not merely medical phenomena but social, economic, and cultural forces that shaped every aspect of human experience. They influenced religious belief, artistic expression, economic development, and political structures, in ways that continued to resonate long after specific epidemics had passed. Understanding these diseases and their impact provides crucial insight into how human societies respond to existential threats, and how communities can maintain cohesion and purpose even when facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. As we reflect on this catalogue of medieval suffering, we are reminded of both how far medical science has advanced and how fragile human life remains. The diseases that terrorized our ancestors continue to exist in modified forms, and new threats constantly emerge to challenge human ingenuity and resilience. The medieval experience with epidemic disease offers both cautionary tales about the consequences of medical ignorance and inspiring examples of human courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. Word count: 1,847. The Deadliest Diseases in Medieval History, Part 6. As dawn broke over the plague-ravaged villages of medieval Europe, survivors emerged from their homes to confront a world forever changed by the relentless march of disease. The Black Death had taken its toll, but it was merely the most infamous of countless pestilences that swept through the medieval world like harbingers of doom. In the aftermath of such devastation, communities that had once thrived now resembled ghost towns, their streets littered with the remnants of lives cut tragically short. The psychological impact of living under the constant threat of disease cannot be overstated. Medieval people developed what we might today recognize as collective trauma, a shared understanding that death could arrive without warning, regardless of age, social status, or perceived virtue. This ever-present spectre of mortality fundamentally shaped how medieval societies functioned, from their religious practices to their economic systems, from their social hierarchies to their most intimate family relationships. Consider the profound changes that occurred in medieval art and literature following major disease outbreaks. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life in a ghastly dance toward the grave. These images served as both artistic expression and social commentary, reminding viewers that death was the great equalizer, claiming peasant and pope alike. The popularity of such themes reveals how deeply disease had penetrated the medieval consciousness, becoming not just a medical reality but a cultural touchstone. Religious institutions, which had long provided comfort and explanation for life's mysteries, found themselves grappling with unprecedented challenges. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? Why did the faithful perish alongside the sinful? These questions led to significant theological debates and, in some cases, to the emergence of new religious movements. Some groups embraced extreme forms of penance, believing that collective suffering might appease divine wrath. Others turned to mysticism, seeking direct spiritual experiences that might provide answers where traditional doctrine had failed. The flagellant movements that arose during the Black Death exemplify this religious upheaval. These groups of penitents would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves in elaborate rituals designed to atone for humanity's sins. They believed that their suffering might intercede with God to end the plague, and for a time they attracted massive followings. However, their radical practices and claims to spiritual authority eventually brought them into conflict with established church hierarchy, leading to their suppression. Economic systems, too, underwent dramatic transformations in response to disease outbreaks. The massive population losses caused by plague created labor shortages that fundamentally altered the relationship between workers and employers. Surviving peasants found themselves in the unprecedented position of being able to demand higher wages and better working conditions. This shift in economic power challenged the rigid feudal system that had dominated European society for centuries. The Statute of Labourers, enacted in England in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from seeking better employment elsewhere. Similar legislation appeared across Europe as authorities struggled to maintain the old order in the face of demographic catastrophe. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful, as the simple reality of supply and demand meant that labor had become more valuable. The resulting social tensions would eventually contribute to major upheavals such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Urban areas experienced particularly dramatic changes in the wake of disease outbreaks. Cities that had grown rapidly during the medieval period suddenly found themselves depopulated, with entire neighborhoods abandoned. Property values plummeted, and guilds struggled to maintain their membership and traditional practices. Some cities never fully recovered from major plague outbreaks, while others eventually rebuilt with different populations and altered social structures. The medical profession itself was transformed by the recurring experience of epidemic disease. While medieval physicians had limited understanding of disease transmission and few effective treatments, the repeated confrontation with mass mortality forced them to develop new approaches to public health. Quarantine measures, though imperfectly understood and inconsistently applied, represented early attempts at disease control that would eventually evolve into more sophisticated public health practices. The concept of contagion, while not fully understood in terms of modern germ theory, began to influence medical thinking and public policy. Authorities increasingly recognized that diseases could spread from person to person, leading to the implementation of isolation measures and travel restrictions during outbreaks. These early public health interventions, crude though they were, represented important steps toward the development of epidemiological thinking. Family structures and social relationships were profoundly affected by the constant threat of disease. Marriage patterns changed as people sought to maximize their chances of survival and economic security. Inheritance laws were frequently modified to account for the reality that entire family lines might be wiped out within a single generation. The practice of appointing multiple heirs and creating complex succession plans became common as people attempted to ensure the continuation of their family legacy, despite the unpredictable nature of epidemic disease. Children, who were particularly vulnerable to many medieval diseases, occupied a complex position in this environment. While infant and child mortality rates were tragically high, survivors often found themselves inheriting property and responsibilities at unusually young ages. This created a generation of young adults who had witnessed extraordinary suffering, but also possessed resources and opportunities that might not have been available under normal circumstances. The constant presence of disease also influenced medieval concepts of time and planning. While we might take for granted the ability to make long-term plans and investments, medieval people lived with the understanding that any such plans might be disrupted by the sudden onset of epidemic disease. This uncertainty contributed to a culture that emphasized immediate gratification in some respects, while also fostering deep spiritual contemplation about the meaning and purpose of life. Trade and commerce were repeatedly disrupted by disease outbreaks, as merchants found their routes blocked by quarantine measures and their markets devastated by population losses. However, these disruptions also created opportunities for innovation and adaptation. New trade routes were established, new products were developed to meet changed circumstances, and new financial instruments were created to manage the increased risks associated with commercial ventures. The intellectual life of medieval Europe was similarly affected by the recurring experience of epidemic disease. Universities, which had been growing in number and influence throughout the medieval period, found their student populations and faculty decimated by plague outbreaks. However, those institutions that survived often emerged stronger, as the concentration of surviving scholars led to intensified intellectual exchange and innovation. Medical education, in particular, was transformed by the practical experience of treating epidemic diseases. While formal medical theory remained rooted in classical texts and humoral theory, practicing physicians were forced to confront the limitations of traditional approaches. This tension between theory and practice would eventually contribute to the development of more empirical approaches to medicine. The legal systems of medieval Europe were also forced to adapt to the realities of epidemic disease. Courts had to develop procedures for handling the massive number of inheritance disputes that arose when entire families perished within short periods. New laws were created to address the problems of abandoned property and disrupted contracts. The very concept of legal continuity was challenged when entire communities might be wiped out, taking with them the local knowledge and customs that had governed legal practice. Women's roles in medieval society were particularly affected by epidemic diseases, both negatively and positively. On one hand, the high mortality rates among women of childbearing age, combined with the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth in an era of limited medical knowledge, created enormous pressures on female survival and reproduction. On the other hand, the labor shortages created by plague outbreaks sometimes opened new economic opportunities for women, allowing them to take on roles that had previously been restricted to men. The rise of beguines and other semi-religious communities of women during the later medieval period can be partially understood as a response to the social disruptions caused by epidemic disease. These communities provided both spiritual fulfillment and economic security for women who might otherwise have struggled to survive in a world where traditional family structures had been disrupted by high mortality rates. Technological innovation was both hindered and spurred by the experience of epidemic disease. While the immediate disruption of craft traditions and apprenticeship systems slowed some forms of technological development, the labor shortages created by plague outbreaks also encouraged the development of labor-saving devices and techniques. The increased use of water and wind power during the later medieval period can be partially attributed to the need to accomplish necessary work with fewer available workers. Military practices and warfare were fundamentally altered by the recurring experience of epidemic disease. Armies became vectors for disease transmission, and military campaigns were frequently disrupted or abandoned due to outbreaks among troops. The development of new forms of siege warfare was influenced by the understanding that disease could be as effective as conventional weapons in reducing enemy strongholds. The psychological impact of living under constant threat extended beyond individual trauma to influence collective decision-making and social institutions. Medieval communities developed elaborate rituals and practices designed to provide some sense of control over forces that were largely beyond their understanding. These ranged from religious processions and public prayers to more secular practices, such as the establishment of hospitals and charitable institutions. The medieval hospital, while rudimentary by modern standards, represented an important institutional response to the challenge of epidemic disease. These institutions served not only as places of treatment, but also as centers for community organization and mutual support during times of crisis. The development of hospital networks across medieval Europe can be understood as an early form of public health infrastructure, designed to provide care for the sick and dying while also serving broader social functions. The experience of recurring epidemic disease also influenced medieval concepts of governance and political authority. Rulers who could effectively respond to health crises gained legitimacy and popular support, while those who appeared helpless in the face of disease, outbreaks often faced challenges to their authority. This created incentives for political leaders to develop more sophisticated approaches to crisis management and public administration. The long-term demographic effects of medieval epidemic diseases extended far beyond the immediate mortality they caused. Repeated population bottlenecks led to genetic changes in European populations, as certain traits that conferred disease resistance became more common. These evolutionary pressures would have lasting effects on European populations and their descendants around the world. As we reflect on this dark chapter of human history, we must recognize that the medieval experience with epidemic disease was not simply a story of suffering and death, but also one of remarkable human resilience and adaptation. Communities that faced near extinction managed to rebuild and even thrive. Individuals who witnessed unimaginable loss found ways to create meaning and purpose in their lives. Institutions that seemed on the verge of collapse evolved and emerged stronger. The legacy of medieval epidemic diseases extends far beyond the historical period in which they occurred. The public health measures, medical practices, and social institutions that developed in response to these challenges provided the foundation for many aspects of modern society. The hard-won knowledge about disease prevention and treatment, accumulated through centuries of trial and error, contributed to the eventual development of modern medicine and epidemiology. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval experience with epidemic disease reminds us of both human vulnerability and human strength. In an age when we face our own global health challenges, we can draw inspiration from the example of medieval communities that faced seemingly insurmountable odds and found ways not merely to survive, but to create something better from the ashes of destruction. Their story is ultimately one of hope, triumphing over despair, of community solidarity overcoming individual fear, and of human ingenuity finding solutions to even the most intractable problems. The deadliest diseases of medieval history were indeed terrible in their scope and impact, but they were not the end of the story. They were instead crucible experiences that tested human resilience and ultimately contributed to the development of more robust, adaptable, and compassionate societies. In learning from their struggles, we honor their memory and better prepare ourselves for the challenges that lie ahead. Looking at your previous script content and the reference materials, I'll continue the script from where we left off, focusing on the devastating diseases that plagued medieval Europe. Here's part 7. But as we've seen, the physical hardships of medieval life were compounded by an enemy far more terrifying than any earthly lord or foreign invader. Disease stalked the medieval world like a relentless predator, claiming victims with ruthless efficiency and reshaping entire civilizations in its wake. Among these microscopic killers, none were more feared or more devastating than the sweeping sickness, a mysterious ailment that would periodically descend upon communities like a biblical plague, leaving death and despair in its path. The sweating sickness first appeared in England in 1485, arriving with such sudden and terrifying force that it seemed to emerge from the very depths of hell itself. Unlike the Black Death, which announced itself with telltale buboes and gave its victims days or weeks to prepare for their fate, the sweating sickness struck with lightning speed. A person could wake up feeling perfectly healthy in the morning and be dead before the sun set that same day. The symptoms were as mysterious as they were deadly. Victims would suddenly be seized by violent chills, followed by an overwhelming fever that caused them to sweat profusely. Their skin would burn to the touch, yet they would shiver uncontrollably. A crushing headache would split their skull like an axe, while their heart raced as if trying to escape their chest. Within hours, many would fall into a stupor, their breathing becoming shallow and labored until it simply stopped altogether. What made the sweating sickness particularly terrifying was its apparent preference for the wealthy and powerful. While plague and other diseases typically ravaged the poor first, this mysterious killer seemed to delight in claiming nobles, merchants, and clergy. It was as if death itself had developed a taste for fine living and sought out those who dwelt in comfortable chambers rather than drafty hovels. The court of Henry VII lived in constant terror during the outbreaks. Nobles would flee London at the first whisper of the disease, abandoning their estates and retreating to remote castles in the countryside. But the sweating sickness seemed to follow them wherever they went, appearing in manor houses and monasteries with equal ferocity. Some believed it was divine punishment for the sins of the wealthy, while others whispered that it was carried on the wind itself, making no young, or those already weakened by other ailments, this mysterious killer preferred victims in the prime of life. Strong men who could wield a sword all day would be reduced to shivering, sweaters locked their doors. The disease seemed to spread wherever people gathered, making normal social and economic life impossible. Trade ground to a halt as merchants refused to enter infected areas, and food shortages became common as farmers abandoned their fields. Thomas More, the great humanist and future saint, described the terror of living through a sweating sickness outbreak in vivid detail. He wrote of how neighbors would cross the street to avoid each other, how families would barricade themselves in their homes for weeks at a time, and how the sound of church bells tolling for the dead became so constant that authorities ordered them silenced to prevent panic. The disease struck England 5 more times over the next 70 years, each outbreak claiming thousands of lives and sending shockwaves through society. The final outbreak occurred in 1551, after which the sweating sickness mysteriously vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, never to return. To this day, historians and medical experts debate what the sweating sickness actually was, with theories ranging from an early form of influenza to a unique viral infection that somehow burned itself out. But the sweating sickness was just one of many mysterious killers that haunted medieval Europe. Dancing mania, also known as St. Vitus's dance, was another bizarre affliction that would periodically seize entire communities. Victims would begin dancing uncontrollably, sometimes for days or even weeks, until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some died from heart failure or stroke brought on by the relentless movement, while others sustained serious injuries from their frenzied gyrations. The first recorded outbreak of dancing mania occurred in Aachen in 1374, where hundreds of people suddenly began dancing in the streets. The affliction spread rapidly to other cities along the Rhine, creating a bizarre spectacle of mass hysteria. Witnesses described how the dancers would leap and spin with wild abandon, their faces contorted in expressions of both ecstasy and agony. They seemed unable to stop themselves, as if possessed by some demonic force that compelled them to dance until their bodies gave out. The most famous outbreak occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when a woman named Frau Trophäa began dancing alone in the street. Within a week, dozens of others had joined her, and within a month, the number of dancers had swollen to around 400. The local authorities, believing that the afflicted could only be cured by more dancing, hired musicians and built a stage to encourage the frenzied movement. This decision proved disastrous, as the epidemic only grew worse, with reports of people dying from heart attacks, strokes, and sheer exhaustion. Medieval physicians were as baffled by dancing mania as they were by the sweating sickness. Some blamed it on hot blood, others on supernatural possession. The Church declared it a punishment for sin and prescribed prayer and pilgrimage as cures. Some communities tried to break the spell by playing different types of music, believing that certain melodies could counteract whatever force was compelling the dancers. Others resorted to physical restraint, tying down the afflicted until the urge to dance passed. Modern medical experts believe that dancing mania was likely a form of mass psychogenic illness, brought on by the extreme stress and hardship of medieval life. The constant threat of disease, famine, and war created a powder keg of psychological tension that occasionally exploded into these bizarre episodes of collective behavior. The dancing may have served as a form of release, allowing people to express their fears and frustrations in a socially acceptable way, even if that expression took a dangerous and ultimately destructive form. Another mysterious affliction that plagued medieval Europe was the English sweats, a different disease entirely from the sweating sickness despite the similar name. This illness was characterized by severe joint pain, fever, and a distinctive rash that would spread across the victim's body like wildfire. Unlike many medieval diseases, the English sweats seemed to affect all social classes equally, striking down peasants and nobles with equal ferocity. The most terrifying aspect of the English sweats was how it could transform healthy individuals into twisted, pain-racked shadows of their former selves. Victims would develop severe arthritis-like symptoms, their joints swelling to grotesque proportions and becoming so painful that even the slightest movement was agony from the inside out. King Henry VI himself was struck down by what many historians believe was the English sweats in 1453. The young king, who had been governing England with reasonable success despite his youth, suddenly fell into a catatonic state that lasted for over a year. During this time, he was completely unresponsive, unable to speak, move, or even recognize his own wife and infant son. The illness effectively ended his active reign and contributed to the political instability that would eventually erupt into the Wars of the Roses. These mysterious diseases were made all the more terrifying by medieval medicine's complete inability to understand or treat them. Physicians of the time operated under the theory of the four humours, believing that all illness was caused by an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile in the body. Their treatments typically involved bloodletting, purging, and the administration of various herbal concoctions, none of which had any real effect on these bizarre afflictions. The helplessness of medieval medicine in the face of these diseases cannot be overstated. When the sweating sickness struck, even the most learned physicians could do nothing but watch their patients die. When dancing mania seized a community, doctors were reduced to wild speculation about supernatural causes. When the English sweats transformed a healthy young king into a mindless shell, the royal physicians could only stand by in bewildered horror. This medical helplessness had profound psychological effects on medieval society. People lived in constant fear of these mysterious killers, never knowing when they might strike next or whom they might claim. The unpredictable nature of these diseases made them seem almost supernatural, as if they were weapons wielded by angry gods or malevolent spirits rather than natural phenomena that could be understood and treated. The impact of these mysterious diseases extended far beyond their immediate victims. Families were torn apart as healthy relatives fled from infected loved ones. Communities were paralyzed by fear and superstition. Economic life ground to a halt during outbreaks as people refused to leave their homes or conduct business with outsiders. The very fabric of medieval society was repeatedly torn and rewoven by these invisible killers. Religious authorities struggled to provide explanations for these inexplicable afflictions. Some clergy declared them to be punishments for collective sin, while others saw them as tests of faith sent by a loving but stern God. Pilgrimages to holy sites increased dramatically during outbreaks as people desperately sought divine intervention. Special masses were held, relics were paraded through the streets, and prayers were offered continuously in hopes of appeasing whatever divine wrath had been unleashed. The psychological trauma inflicted by these diseases was perhaps as devastating as their physical effects. Survivors often struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of watching loved ones die in agony while being powerless to help. Communities that had been struck by these mysterious afflictions often developed elaborate rituals and superstitions designed to prevent their return, even though no one truly understood what had caused them in the first place. Perhaps most tragically, these mysterious diseases often struck just as communities were beginning to recover from other disasters. A village that had survived a plague outbreak might be devastated by dancing mania. A noble family that had weathered political upheaval might be wiped out by the sweating sickness. The cumulative effect was to keep medieval society in a state of constant vulnerability, never allowing people to feel truly secure or safe. The legacy of these mysterious diseases extended far beyond the medieval period. The memory of the sweating sickness lingered in English consciousness for centuries, influencing how people thought about disease and contagion. The fear of sudden, inexplicable illness shaped medical practice and public health policy well into the modern era. Even today, when new diseases emerge, there are echoes of the terror that medieval people felt when confronted with these incomprehensible killers. As we reflect on these mysterious medieval diseases, we are reminded of how fragile human life truly is, and how much we owe to the advances in medical science that protect us today. The physicians who struggled helplessly against the sweating sickness and dancing mania were not incompetent or ignorant. They were simply operating with the limited knowledge and tools available to them. Their dedication to their patients, even in the face of diseases they could not understand or treat, represents one of the more admirable aspects of medieval medicine. Yet, these mysterious killers also reveal something profound about the human spirit. Despite living under the constant threat of inexplicable death, medieval people continued to build, create, love, and hope. They married and had children knowing those children might be claimed by forces beyond their understanding. They invested in the future, even when the present seemed so uncertain. In their courage to continue living fully in the face of such uncertainty, we find inspiration for our own struggles against the unknown challenges that await us. The story of these mysterious medieval diseases is ultimately a testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience. They remind us that for all our modern medical advances, we are still engaged in an ongoing battle against forces that seek to cut short our time on this earth. But they also show us that even in the darkest of times, when death stalks the land like a hungry wolf, the human spirit refuses to be completely extinguished. In that refusal, in that stubborn determination to keep living and loving despite everything, we find one of the most beautiful and inspiring aspects of our shared human story. Here's part 8 of The Deadliest Diseases in Medieval History script. As dawn broke over the medieval world, another scourge began to manifest itself across the landscape, one that would prove just as devastating as any plague or pestilence. While the Black Death had ravaged bodies with its bubonic fury, this new enemy attacked the very foundations of society itself through a different kind of contagion. The disease of social division and the pestilence of power had begun to spread through every level of medieval civilization, creating wounds that would fester for generations to come. The rigid caste system that governed medieval life could torture souls for entire lifetimes. Consider the plight of a typical serf family, bound to their lord's land as surely as if they had been chained there. Unlike the swift devastation of plague, their suffering was a slow, grinding affliction that passed from parent to child like a hereditary curse. They could not flee their circumstances as one might flee a plague-ridden city. Their very existence was defined by a social pathology that deemed them less than human, mere tools to be used and discarded at their master's whim. The symptoms of this social disease were everywhere to be seen. Malnutrition ravaged the peasant classes, not because food was unavailable, but because the fruits of their own labor were systematically extracted by their betters. Children grew stunted, not from lack of care, but from a system that viewed their potential as property to be exploited. Women suffered under multiple layers of oppression, their bodies and lives controlled by fathers, husbands and lords in an endless hierarchy of domination. This social contagion proved remarkably resistant to treatment. Unlike physical diseases that might burn themselves out or succumb to crude medieval remedies, the illness of inequality seemed to strengthen with each passing generation. The very institutions that might have provided cure, the church, the law, the nobility itself, had become infected carriers of the disease, spreading it even as they claimed to offer salvation. The church, despite its teachings of universal brotherhood and divine love, had become perhaps the most virulent spreader of social pestilence. Priests preached that poverty was a blessing, while they themselves lived in luxury. They taught that suffering in this world would be rewarded in the next, effectively inoculating the oppressed against any desire to seek justice in their current lives. The ecclesiastical hierarchy mirrored and reinforced the secular order, creating a double infection that proved nearly impossible to cure. Yet perhaps nowhere was this social pathology more evident than in the treatment of those already afflicted by physical disease. Lepers, cast out from society and forced to announce their presence with bells and clappers, suffered not just from their physical condition, but from a social death that preceded their biological one. They became living symbols of how medieval society treated those it deemed unworthy, creating a template for exclusion that would be applied to countless other groups deemed dangerous or undesirable. The mentally ill faced similar social death sentences. Viewed as possessed by demons or cursed by God, they were often chained, beaten, or simply abandoned to die. Their conditions, which we now understand as treatable illnesses, were interpreted through the lens of a society that saw suffering as either divine punishment or demonic influence. The social disease of superstition compounded their physical and mental anguish, creating layers of torment that no medieval remedy could touch. Women who dared to practice healing arts faced accusations of witchcraft, their knowledge and compassion twisted into evidence of supernatural malevolence. The social contagion of misogyny infected even the pursuit of medical knowledge, ensuring that half the population's wisdom and insight would be systematically suppressed and often violently eliminated. Thousands of women who might have advanced medical understanding instead found themselves burning at stakes, their expertise consumed by the flames of ignorance and fear. The disease of violence had become endemic to medieval society, spreading through every social interaction like a fever that never broke. Lords settled disputes through warfare that devastated the countryside and slaughtered the innocent. Knights, supposedly bound by codes of chivalry, routinely engaged in rape, pillage, and murder. Violence was not seen as a symptom to be cured, but as a natural state of affairs, even a virtue when directed against the right targets. This normalization of brutality created its own pathological cycle. Children raised in violent households became violent adults. Communities that survived through raiding and warfare could not easily transition to peaceful coexistence. The very skills that kept one alive in medieval society, the ability to fight, to dominate, to take what one needed by force, became impediments to creating a healthier social order. Economic systems had developed their own diseased characteristics, creating artificial scarcities that enriched the few while impoverishing the many. The concentration of land ownership in the hands of a tiny elite meant that vast populations lived perpetually on the edge of starvation, not because the earth could not support them, but because human greed had infected the distribution of resources. This economic pathology proved remarkably persistent, creating famines in times of plenty, and ensuring that even good harvests brought little relief to those who worked the fields. Trade networks, while bringing new goods and ideas, also served as vectors for social diseases. The pursuit of profit often trumped human welfare, leading to the exploitation of distant populations and the spread of slavery and indentured servitude. Merchants might bring spices and silks from foreign lands, but they also brought new forms of exploitation and new justifications for treating certain groups as less than human. The legal systems of medieval Europe had themselves become infected with the diseases they were meant to cure. Justice was not blind, but rather selectively sighted, seeing clearly when the poor transgressed but growing mysteriously dim when the wealthy and powerful committed crimes. Courts that should have protected the innocent instead became instruments of oppression, legitimizing theft, murder, and exploitation when committed by those with sufficient social standing. Trial by ordeal and trial by combat represented the complete surrender of justice to superstition and violence. Rather than seeking truth through investigation and evidence, medieval legal systems often relied on divine intervention or brute force to determine guilt or innocence. This judicial pathology ensured that outcomes reflected power dynamics rather than actual justice, perpetuating the very inequalities that generated crime and conflict in the first place. The educational systems, such as they were, had been thoroughly infected with social disease. Literacy was hoarded by the elite like a precious medicine, kept from the masses who might use knowledge to question their circumstances. The church controlled most learning, ensuring that education served to reinforce existing power structures rather than challenge them. Libraries were locked away in monasteries, their contents available only to those who had already sworn allegiance to the established order. This deliberate cultivation of ignorance among the general population served as a form of intellectual epidemic, keeping people in darkness about alternatives to their current suffering. Folk knowledge and traditional wisdom were systematically suppressed or demonized, leaving communities vulnerable to both physical and social diseases that might have been prevented or cured through broader access to information and learning. The very concept of childhood had been infected with adult pathologies. Children were viewed as miniature adults, expected to work and fight and suffer, without the protection that their developmental needs required. Child mortality was accepted with a resignation that bordered on the pathological, as if the deaths of the young were simply part of the natural order rather than a preventable tragedy. Young girls were married off to older men in arrangements that would be recognized today as systematic abuse. Boys were trained for violence from an early age, their natural compassion and creativity suppressed in favor of martial skills and aggressive dominance. The innocence and potential of childhood were sacrificed to perpetuate social systems that served adult interests while devastating young lives. Perhaps most insidiously, the social diseases of medieval society had developed a kind of psychological immunity that made them resistant to reform. People had become so accustomed to suffering and inequality that they often defended the very systems that oppressed them. Serfs would sometimes fight to protect the lords who exploited them. Women would enforce the restrictions that limited their own freedom. The oppressed had internalized their oppression so thoroughly that they became willing participants in their own subjugation. This psychological dimension of social disease proved particularly difficult to treat because it operated below the level of conscious awareness. People did not recognize their conditions as pathological because they had never known health. They mistook chronic social illness for the natural state of human existence, making them resistant to treatments that might have offered genuine healing and liberation. Religious authorities exploited this psychological vulnerability by teaching that earthly suffering was not only inevitable, but spiritually beneficial. They created elaborate theological justifications for inequality and oppression, convincing their flocks that resistance to injustice was actually resistance to God's will. This spiritual infection proved particularly virulent because it attacked people's deepest hopes and fears, turning their faith into an instrument of their own oppression. The merchant classes, emerging as a new social force during the later medieval period, brought their own pathologies to an already diseased tract rather than feudal obligation, creating different but equally oppressive relationships between rich and poor. Urban centers, growing around commercial activity, became breeding grounds for new social diseases. Overcrowding, pollution, and crime flourished in these early cities, while traditional support networks broke down under the pressure of rapid change. The anonymity of city life allowed for new forms of exploitation, while undermining the community bonds that had provided some protection for the vulnerable in rural settings. Even attempts at reform often carried the seeds of new social diseases. Crusading movements, while ostensibly religious in nature, became vehicles for violence, greed, and cultural destruction. Efforts to purify the church led to increased persecution of minorities and dissenters. Programs meant to help the poor often reinforced their dependency and powerlessness. The social diseases of medieval society proved remarkably adaptable, mutating to survive new conditions and infecting even well-intentioned efforts at improvement. Like biological pathogens, they developed resistance to treatments and found new hosts when old ones became inhospitable. This adaptability ensured their persistence across centuries and their transmission to subsequent generations. Yet, even in this landscape of social pathology, there were signs of health and resistance. Communities sometimes came together to protect their most vulnerable members. Individuals occasionally transcended their circumstances to create beauty, knowledge, or compassion that enriched human experience. Reform movements, however flawed, kept alive the possibility that society could be healed of its diseases. The very persistence of hope in the face of overwhelming social sickness testified to something indomitable in the human spirit. People continued to love their children, care for their neighbors, and dream of better worlds, even when all evidence suggested that such dreams were futile. This stubborn optimism served as a kind of social antibiotic, preventing the complete triumph of despair and keeping alive the possibility of eventual healing. Women, despite systematic oppression, found ways to preserve and transmit knowledge, particularly in areas of healing and midwifery. Their informal networks served as alternative channels of communication and support, creating spaces where different values and practices could survive. Their resilience in the face of multiple forms of oppression provided a model for resistance that would inspire future generations. Religious mystics and reformers, working within and against established church structures, kept alive visions of justice and equality that challenged prevailing orthodoxies. Their writings and teachings, often suppressed or marginalized in their own time, planted seeds that would eventually grow into more comprehensive challenges to social disease. Even the emergence of new social classes and economic arrangements, however problematic, created cracks in the rigid hierarchies that had defined medieval society. Merchants, artisans, and professionals developed their own interests and perspectives that did not always align with traditional elite values. These emerging groups would eventually provide the social base for more systematic challenges to medieval pathologies. The diseases that afflicted medieval society were not merely historical curiosities, but rather warning signs of what happens when human communities lose their way. The social pathologies of that era continue to echo in our own time, reminding us that the struggle for health and justice is never finally won, but must be renewed by each generation. The medieval experience teaches us that social diseases, like biological ones, require constant vigilance and active treatment to prevent their spread and recurrence. Understanding these historical patterns of social sickness can help us recognize similar pathologies in our own time and work more effectively to create healthier communities. The medieval world's legacy is not just one of suffering and oppression, but also of the persistent human capacity to imagine and work toward better ways of living together. In studying their diseases, we learn not only about their failures, but also about the enduring possibilities for healing and transformation that exist within human society. As the plague's shadow lifted from the medieval world, a new chapter in human understanding slowly began to unfold. The devastating losses had paradoxically created opportunities: vacant lands, labor shortages, and the gradual weakening of feudal bonds. Yet even as society rebuilt itself from the ashes of pestilence, the fundamental challenges of disease and medical ignorance remained deeply entrenched in the fabric of medieval life. Among the most feared and misunderstood afflictions of the Middle Ages was leprosy, a disease that struck terror into the hearts of all who encountered it. Unlike the swift devastation of plague, leprosy was a slow, creeping horror that transformed its victims into living outcasts, banished from society and condemned to exist on its very margins. The disease, now known as Hansen's disease, was poorly understood by medieval physicians who attributed it to everything from divine punishment for sin to corrupted humours and poisonous air. The first signs of leprosy were often subtle: a patch of discolored skin, a loss of sensation in the fingers or toes, or small nodules appearing on the face. But as the disease progressed, its effects became increasingly horrific and unmistakable. The bacteria that caused leprosy attacked the peripheral nerves, leading to loss of feeling in the extremities. Without sensation, victims would unknowingly injure themselves, leading to infections, gangrene, and the gradual loss of fingers, toes, and even entire limbs. The face, too, bore the terrible marks of the disease. The nose would collapse as cartilage was destroyed, creating the characteristic leonine appearance that medieval people found so frightening. Eyebrows would disappear, and the skin would become thick and nodular. Most tragically, many sufferers would lose their... If diagnosed with leprosy, the victim faced a fate that was in many ways worse than death. They were declared legally dead, their property was seized, and they were expelled from all human community. The ritual of separation was formalized in a ceremony that resembled a funeral. The leper would be brought to the church, where a priest would read the burial service over them while they stood in their own grave. Earth would be thrown upon their feet, symbolizing their death to the world. They were then given a wooden clapper or bell to warn others of their approach, dressed in a distinctive hooded